Hello and welcome to this Churchyard Ramble. Today we're going to be rambling over the churchyard, looking at the life and times of Alice Steward. Now, these online sessions together are all about getting over the frustration that we can't actually meet in person. We're living through a historic time, so we might as well take some time to explore history. And I am enormously grateful that these little rambles are supported by Enjoy Sutton and the Sutton Civic Society. Now, Enjoy Sutton, they're part of Successful Sutton, and really it is to do with the High Street and the 500 odd businesses and organisations that make the High Street their home and really contribute to making Sutton such a vibrant and wonderful place to live. And in Sutton Civic Society is the critical friend of the council. It's a community group that shares information about planning changes, etc. So if you really want to get involved in Sutton, understand how we can make Sutton a better place for everyone, then get involved with the Sutton Civic Society as well. I'm going to be touching on a number of different things, and as we look at these different topics today, I'm going to be talking about trade, I'll be talking about the life of a farmer, I'll be talking about historical source documents. If you're interested in history, then please do take a look at Sutton College's history and culture classes, and you can explore those at suttoncollege.ac.uk. Okay, so who was Alice Steward and what do we know about her? Well, we know Alice through a will that was left. It was left in something called the Spage Register, which is a book which contains some of the earliest records of the Archdeacon of Surrey. Then they date really from the 1484 onwards. I think the Spage Register goes on to about 1490. So it's got a number of different wills in there. They've been collected and looked at by different societies and published, and there are a number actually that mention Sutton. Now, these wills aren't of great people, they are of poorer, more humble types of people, very much rooted in the agricultural life of Sutton in the Middle Ages. And what is so interesting is that when I look at this, it really changed my perception of life in the Middle Ages and the life of women in the Middle Ages. I can't think of the idea that it was terribly poor and grinding poverty, and women were the more oppressed of anyone. But actually, we look at the register and we start to see that there is a sense of prosperity, there's community, there's family links, and we must know probably about, from the will and the collection and the other wills within this Spage Register, we're probably able to start identifying about 20 plus names of a village that had about 100 people at that time. So we're talking about a good chunk of Sutton's medieval history is really well documented, and a lot of knowledge can be deduced from the ink on the pages. Well, so what do we know about Alice Steward? Well, we know that she made her will in around about March of 1484. So she's probably, when she died, she was a widow. She's making a will on her own. She's very much in control of herself. This is a femme sole. In law, this is a woman who isn't answerable to a husband, not answerable to a father, so she has complete control over her affairs. And she's carrying on the family business, and she is the person who is donating and allocating the money from that will. And we know from the will, if I sort of summarise before I dive in, that she left really a lot of livestock. She had 77 sheep. She had a pair or a yoke of oxen. She had a cow, along with other land and buildings and cash. And you can start to infer things like with so many sheep, and we know how many sheep she has because she's allocating these different things. She must have grazed those sheep somewhere, as she had a yoke of oxen, so she must have had land that she put to the plough, and had arable land, and she also had a cow for milk, and so she had at least domestic dairy production. And I think if we start just thinking about the source document and the will itself, let's actually look at that. I'm going to drop in here a English language translation. I don't have the original document. I don't have a picture of that. So very much this is what she left. So this is the will of Alice Steward. She wanted to be buried in the churchyard of Sutton. So she wasn't hoping to be buried in the church. She recognised her status was that she didn't have the right to be buried in the church. She wasn't clergy. She wasn't noble. Her hope was very much to be buried in the church, and so she's buried in the churchyard of Sutton. She does give to the church a coverlet, so a cloth for the altar, to the reparation and upkeep of the said church, 20 sheep, to the high altar of the said church, for my tithes forgot, 12 pence, for the maintenance of the light of St. Catherine in said church, 1/4 of malt, to the mother church of Winchester, 6 pence. An honest priest of good fame shall celebrate in the said church for an entire year, for my soul and the souls of all my friends. To the said church 4 torches, to each of my godsons 1 sheep. To Alice Hitchcock, my niece, 3 sheep and 1 red cow. To Walter, my servant, 4 sheep. To Richard Stewart, 1 large brass pot. To Nicholas Brooke and Emota his wife, my daughter, 20 sheep, a yoke of oxen, and all my utensils. To John Hall, 2 sheep. To William Mayor, 2 sheep. To each of the sons of William Wood, 1 sheep. To each of the sons of Richard Cook, 1 sheep. To William Plaistow, 1 sheep. To Henry Taylor, 2 sheep. To John Bulk, 1 sheep. To John Pound, 1 sheep. To Giles Croucher, 1 sheep. To John Stewart, 2 sheep. To each of the sons of John Gilden, 1 sheep. To Richard Stewart, 3 sheep. To the repair of the highway in Sutton, 3 shillings, 8 pence. To Matilda Dunning, 2 sheep. To Thomas Hitchcock, 2 sheep. To Robert Hanswell, 12 pence. To Roger Morris, 1 sheep. To the wife of John Smaley, 2 sheep. I will that Richard Cook and John Buckley, my fees, shall deliver to Nicholas Brooke and Emota his wife a sufficient estate according to law in the whole tenement called Peppers, with its appurtenances in Sutton, to hold to Nicholas and Emota his wife during the life of said Emota, with remainder to Richard Stewart, son of John Stewart, and the legitimate heirs of his body, with remainders in default to John, son of said Richard Stewart. To John Stewart, son of Thomas Stewart, to the right heirs of me, the same Alice for ever. Robert Gilden, to have certain tenement in Sutton called Stotes, with its appurtenances to him and the legitimate heirs of his body, and by default to my right heirs, Richard Cook and his fellows my fees, shall give Nicholas and Emota his wife a lease in a croft of land called North Rushmead in Sutton, to hold said croft of land with its appurtenances to said Nicholas and Emota his wife, for her in survivorship to find yearly 3 wax candles of each 2 pounds in weight, to stand before the images of St. Mary the Virgin, the Crucifix, and St. Nicholas in the church of Sutton. The said Nicholas and Emota shall have all those lands called Gadis in Sutton until one Richard Stewart shall come to the age of 21 years at an annual rent to the said use of said Richard, according to the discretion of my fees. Richard Cook and Nicholas Brooke, executors, for the welfare of my soul. But that document, that big document, suddenly opens up to us really knowledge about who Alice had been married to, John, and it opens up who her daughter is, Emota, who she's married to, who her son is, Richard. We know that Emota is older than Richard. Richard has not yet reached 21, so we can put a guess, and maybe here Alice is in her 50s. So we can start to get a sense of who these people are. We see all this in context, and the fact that this is written as a will. It probably helps that the rector of Sutton at the time, or vicar of Sutton at the time, it was a vicar of Sutton at the time, was a man called William Morland. William Morland was a obviously an educated man. He was a priest, but he was a very, very well educated man, and he knew the law. He was master of the rolls at one point during his career, and we're looking here very much at a point in time when we've got England in 1483 tied up in big historical movement. So we know that that she died in 1483 or 84. We're not entirely sure it's 83 or 84. There had been the death of Edward IV and Edward V acceding to the throne in 1483. We have at this point, if in her lifetime, if indeed she is about 50 years old, Alice would have been born then in the 1430s. She would have been born in the reign of Henry VI. She would have seen all of the problems with the Wars of the Roses, with in 1471 the death of Henry VI. Did he die, or was he murdered? How Henry VI's body went to Chertsey Abbey. Remember, the Lord of the Manor at this point in Sutton's history is actually Chertsey, the Abbot of Chertsey, and so there would have been a relationship between Sutton and Chertsey. Interestingly, Alice chooses not to mention Chertsey Abbey at all. She remembers the tithes, and that's going to William Morland, and William Morland is there the rector, is the vicar of Sutton. He has a portion of the tithes. The greater tithes do go to Chertsey Abbey, but she hasn't got any affection for it. She does have affection for Winchester. I'll be talking about spirituality, medieval spirituality, next week, and all of the money that she leaves to the light of St. Catherine and the altar, and give a sense of what the medieval church looked like. We can deduce that from her will as well. But we see she lived through enormously troubled times. So you've had the background right at the beginning of her life that is still going on with the With the wars in France, this is the 100 Years' War coming to an end, and the loss of English possessions in France. We see that she's plugged in with so many sheep. I counted there, she's got at least 77 sheep. It's an important part of the economy of Sutton. So sheep to the English economy was massively important, with wool being passed out into the Flemish markets. Actually, some of the wars really were driven by the threat of the King of France against the Duke of Burgundy, and the dependency of the Burgundy economy on English wool, and that need to maintain markets really drove some of the English foreign policy into support of Burgundy and making war against France. But sheep were a hugely important part of the economy of Sutton. We've got records of the Abbot of Chertsey, who's the Lord Mayor of the Manor of Sutton, keeping essentially about 1,500 sheep on Banstead Downs during the previous century. And that's a huge amount of sheep. You imagine them running as separate managed flocks all the way from really Barrow Hedges in Carshalton, all the way over the downs to Epsom and Ewell. The market would have been in Carshalton. Carshalton had a market. There was a charter. We know that, and I've been checking market registers and looking at that, so we know that. And if there's a very useful gazetteer of markets, which are actually documented. So I know that Alice would have gone to Carshalton for the market every Tuesday, and that had been running since the 13th century. There was a fair in Carshalton in September. So every September, that was actually on the feast of the Nativity of the Virgin. So at the beginning of September, at the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, 8th of September, there would have been a big fair in which a lot of the wool that hadn't already been sold into London would have been sold, and any of the things that Alice wanted for her family would have been obtained there. Now, in our rambling, I want to keep going back into thinking about what that meant. She managed a flock of 77 sheep. She didn't do it on her own. She had families. She existed in a network of kinship. She had children, and she also had servants, at least one servant named in her will. And so she is an example of somebody who was a really prosperous peasant. The sort of person that you would probably she certainly wasn't a villain, and she was probably started to achieve the status that would be later on described as yeoman. Her class was such that she had essentially freed herself from most of the constraints of the feudal system. And what's interesting about that is that she does mention fees. These are from the will. She talks about Richard Cook and his fellows, my fees. This is a way of assigning land to people, but retaining the use of it. And it's a way of breaking some of the legal shackles that a feudal allocation of land would come in. And I can well imagine William Morland, the rector, being part of setting up some of these arrangements, trying to break the power of the Lord of the Manor We know that actually there's a court case with William Morland where he took the abbot of Chertsey to court. One of the first things that he did about the enclosure of land up on what is now Ben Hilton area, in the Ben Hill area. So the abbot had been trying to enclose for his own private use some woodland, probably because the abbot needed to identify plots of land with suitable timber for building purposes, but William Morland stood up for the people within his parish and maintained it as an unenclosed land. So Alice was in this relationship which was increasingly financial, still heavily kindred based, but breaking some of the restrictions on imposed by the feudal system. So we're really at the end, and she's living at a time when culturally all sorts of changes are happening. You've got greater availability of books. Not only have we got the phenomenon of printing starting to come in at her time. Now she doesn't have a book, but let's say that we know that William Morland has books, and interestingly, William Morland's own will refers to books in his possession, which we know were handwritten books, but because of the mistakes within the handwritten books, we know that they are actually copies of printed works. So one of the strange things is that that you still had the hand scribing businesses which were copying books, but printing had allowed the sheer volume of literature to come in, and this was having all sorts of really unforeseen effects within society. So she was living at a time in which there were big movements. We know really the dominant movements. We call them the Renaissance, but you might not think that had any impact for a peasant woman in Sutton. But some of the ideas of learning we had right at the beginning of the 15th century, new forms of learning and studying scripture with the Lollards coming in. I've already shown that really in some of the previous rambles we're only 12 miles away from London. News would have arrived through the regular toings and froings along the roads within 2.5 hours. If it arrived in a through a courier from a battlefield like the Battle of Tewkesbury, or you had news of a crop failure or a shipwreck, it would have arrived in London and then disseminated very rapidly to the villages around. And we mustn't think that there's somehow there's no transportation, there's no toing and froing. We know that we can infer that Alice had been on pilgrimage to Winchester. She left money to Winchester. I'll be talking about religious spirituality and the cult of saints next week. She would have, her world was not defined by just the village. We know that kinships, she owned land, and we can infer that she owned land as far away as Croydon. That's through other wills and relationships. We know that they had involvement in multiple places. These are people who are buying and selling land well outside where their home is. and even if you were a shepherd, you might actually choose that you leave your money to, and you live in Sutton, you might leave your money to another church, not Sutton Church, but somewhere else, if that's where you felt more spiritually at home. Now, so just a point about transport. and the reality of where Alice was in her business. She had this big flock of sheep, 77 to 80 sheep within possibly a share of around 1,500 running up and down the bounds, running up and down Banstead Downs. A lot of sheep there. Now, if she had those flock of around 77 sheep, that would have meant that if they're sheared in mid-May or mid-July, so this is a busy time for her as the shearing takes place. It's also, by the way, because we know she's got a plough, she's tied into the arable system. This period before late July and beginning of August, when the first proper crops are harvested. This is the wheat and the barley are harvested on the arable land and on the common. Then what we're looking at is a period of time known as the hungry gap. So the hungry gap is where most of the stores of winter have been used up and we don't have the new harvest in. And it's the hardest for the shepherds, for Sutton. It was a really hard time because you've got, in the hungry gap, you've got all the sheep shearing that needed to take place and preparing those fleeces for market. In order to cope with the hungry gap, you'd want to be able to start getting them sold as quickly as possible. And it takes about 20 fleeces to fill a wool sack. So, and that would be about 60 kilograms, or if you a kilogram is 2.2 pounds. So if you think about a kilogram of sugar, a pound is actually 2.2 pounds of sugar. That's 132 pounds. To get to London, you would either have been using carters, and we know from the next century that there were carters operating from Sutton, because carters from Sutton were employed in during the building of Nonsuch Palace. So we know that there was a carter in Sutton who could have taken the carting up to London, or Alice would have would have had a regular purchaser. You can imagine all over these northern slopes of the Downs, from Carshalton all the way through to Cheam, through to what was the manor of Cuddington, through onwards. Then you would have had people touring in great big mule trains collecting the wool sacks, and you would have received probably a one, because it's a dead weight of 60 kilograms. Theoretically, a live weight, somebody on the riding it, you could fit two people. But actually, with 60 kilograms, you could probably only have one mule carrying one sack, maybe two if you're pushing it. But that means you can imagine these long trains of mules and sacks going into London, and she would have had to have had a place to store that. And you know that we've got in Sutton big barns built of chalk and flint, and we've mentioned the tithe barn in there. But if she's able to fill 4 sacks of wool, remember 20 fleeces go into a wool sack of around 60 kilograms, then 4 sacks of wool to market, she would expect to earn around about £16 in 1480. And we know that from some of the National Archives translation of value. And if she had about £16 in her pocket through the sale of wheels, that's her cash income, then that gives you a sense that she could have employed a skilled tradesman for nearly 2 years, just every year herself. So we know she had servants. She must have paid them something. and she had money left to be able to acquire more land for her family as she prospered with the wool trade. Now, I'm going to start to leave it there. In terms of that, we've got more. We could use this as a place to go off and talk about other people, but I think I want to leave people like William Morland, the rector, and Kellett, his kinsman, and all the other sort of little relationships that we know from the wills, to another session, because I think one of the things I'd quite like to do is to see whether or not I can build, if you like, a telephone directory for the village of Sutton in the 1480s and 1490s. If I can get the end of the 15th century, the names and addresses of these people and compare them with others, we can start to pinpoint people in history in the geography of Sutton. Because we've got some of the names that are mentioned in the documents carry through into the later periods, and we've got that sense of continuity. I've come to the end of the ramble for today. Please do check out the YouTube channel where you can see others. Some are short rambles and some are long. Last week's was over an hour, so I was probably too enthusiastic there. But do check out those little bits of history if you're interested in them. And if you are interested in history, then please also go to Sutton College. Their history and culture classes are fantastic. You'll be able to explore many of the themes that we've discussed in today's ramble. Next week, I'm going to be going to look at the spirituality of the people like Alice Steward, like William Morland, like all their contemporaries. The cult of the saints and the medieval spirituality is what we'll be looking at, and that's next week. But for now, I'm going to say thank you very much for being with me on this ramble. I'm going to say goodbye. So long, Sutton. Your history.